Hello to everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. For those of you who have not met me before, my name is Kira and I'm the programs manager at ISM. I know for some of you, we definitely have been in contact before, and I'm happy you could join us today. I have with us today, we have a ISM alumni, Joan Ball, who's going to be speaking to you, and I will talk a little bit about her bio before she goes into her presentation. Just a few small housekeeping rules. This will be recorded, so if somebody is not able to stay for the entire time, we will be able to have this available for you to view after. And as well, again, if you would like to turn on your video cameras, please feel free. If not, that's okay, but it's always nice to see some faces. For questions, we would love to have everybody put their questions in the chat. And Joan will be able to kind of look and see if there's any questions that maybe we could answer right away, but if not, we'll definitely have a Q&A time at the end. If you have a question that you really want to ask right away, please feel free. I think there's sometimes on Zoom the hand raise option, or you can just unmute and say, hey, I have a question, can I ask? But it's great to have the questions in the chat as well. That always helps us to kind of see what questions everybody has. And so just to talk a little bit about our guest speaker today, this is the first one of the new year. We love having ISM guest speakers because we have such interesting and varied alumni who graduated from ISM. So Joan is our first one for 2023. And we'll have a few more as the year continues. But just to give a short introduction, Joan is an associate professor of marketing and also a founder of the Womb Service Design Lab, a participatory action research and service design consultancy for small business. She graduated ISM in 2012 with her PhD. A lot of Joan's research and consulting work strongly focuses on service design, consumer behavior, and how to best create service systems and processes that result in social impact and human well-being. And as mentioned, that she earned her PhD at ISM, and she also has a MS in organizational leadership and a BA in economics. Also, she has recently written a book, which she's going to be talking about today. It came out in April of 2022, called Stop, Ask, Explore, Learn to Navigate Change at Uncertain Times. So she'll be able to discuss about this with you. And so I will do now, that's sort of a short introduction about Joan. She'll be able to explain much more about herself, but I will give the floor to her to be able to begin her presentation.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. And hello, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a big fan of ISM. Being able to get my PhD at ISM was a threshold for me in terms of making a career switch from practice in marketing and public relations that I did for about 17 years. And then I wound up getting involved in academic work. So I was in a situation where, had it not been for ISM and this program being structured the way that it was, because I was working full-time while I did the PhD. I was married and had children at home when I was doing the PhD, and I had a great opportunity to be able to teach at St. John's University, and would not have been able to accept that opportunity if I wasn't able to get my PhD in a rather compressed timetable through the ISM program. So it's really a pleasure to be back and to be chatting with all of you. I just want to underscore the notion that questions are not only encouraged, but they're welcomed. And we'll see how the rhythm of the conversation goes, whether we, kind of stop along the way, or if people, I will tell you that I'm actually not going to focus too much on the chat. So I'll rely, hopefully, if you can help me out with that, pointing to the chat, because especially when I'm sharing my screen, it's hard to kind of toggle between the two. So please help me to understand how I can tailor what we're talking about to your circumstances. I really welcome that. And so from a topic perspective, learning to navigate times of uncertainty, before I dive into, why this topic and where it came from for me, I want to just emphasize the word learning in this. I think that frequently We have how-to books, right? How to do X or how to do Y. This is very intentionally not a how-to. The notion, yes, this work is based upon about 12 years of research. I've been quite, and I'll talk about how that research started and where it took me. So there is some insight and rigor behind it, but the notion that I would be able to get some understanding about navigating uncertainty and then be able to tell someone else how to do it, I think is not, at best, it's unhelpful, and at worst, it's actually harmful, right? And I think that this is a big challenge that we have with a lot of our thought leadership. And I think we have to be careful about it. People who are pursuing PhDs and looking to go out and have some thought leadership in the world, that the ways that people do things are very unique to them and to their context. And that's a big part of my research, is understanding how contextual things like navigating uncertain times are. And so Learn to really speaks to the notion of, change and transitions and uncertainty and disruptions are inevitable. And we've all faced them. No one would even be in a program like this if we hadn't made big changes in our lives. However, we can get better at navigating them, right? It's like any other capacity that we can grow, but we rarely talk about growing our capacity to be able to navigate uncertainty. And in many ways, we wait until the disruptions happen to think about how we deal with disruptions. And much of what we'll talk about today is really in this question of how do we think about disruptions before they happen? How do we familiarize ourselves with how we are in times of disruption so that we can be highly self-aware? And then how can we gather the resources and the toolboxes that we will need for disruption when it comes, rather than trying to react to it in the moment? Because my research, which really began, and it's a good way to kind of transition into diving in here, the research really began for me in trying to understand the concept of stuckness. I was seeing a lot of my students at first, but then also young professionals and even mid-career professionals that I was working with, describing to me feeling stuck and lost. Those were the two words that came. I feel stuck. I've got my degree. I've got even a job that I thought that I would want, but I just feel stuck. I can't seem to figure out how to move forward. And, these were educated people. They were people who had aspirations. They didn't even some of them didn't have resource barriers, right? They may not have been highly resourced, but they weren't in a situation where the stuckness was coming because they didn't know how to, they didn't have the resources to pay their bills. But it just seemed like they couldn't figure out how to move forward. And I didn't understand it. And so I really began to dig deeply into this using a form of research called action research. Some of you may have encountered participatory action research, others might not. It's a qualitative methodology that, rather than observing people in order to learn about them, you actually engage with people directly. And so I really started to learn about stuckness by helping people to get unstuck. And so I did it in a variety of different ways. I formed cohorts. I worked with people one-on-one. I worked in corporate settings. I worked in community settings. I worked with people who were very, CEO level and executive level people. I worked with people who owned very small businesses that were not turning profits, right? I tried to do highly resourced, under-resourced. And what was interesting is whether I was talking to the CEO of a large global financial services company, or I was speaking to someone who owned a salon in a neighborhood in New York City, that this point of inflection that happens when we wind up getting an interruption or a disruption that leads us to not know what to do next, we react to it remarkably the same. That feeling of lostness when we don't know what to do next is a pretty universal human experience. And it really doesn't matter how much we have when the disruption happens and we don't know what to do next. Those are the real two components, because sometimes we have a disruption and we do know what to do next. We have some clarity. But when we don't have that clarity, there are some real similarities. And one of the similarities, or a key similarity that happens among people, is that we have something that in learning theory is called disjunction, right? And it's this notion that we hit that point where we have some kind of information that is a threshold into the unknown. I'm not sure what to do next. This happens often, we go to school, we focus so hard on getting a degree, we graduate with a PhD or a bachelor's degree or whatever it might be, and then it's what now? What, right? What do I do with this? We have this clear sense of the work that we're doing to finish. But then even something positive like a graduation is an interruption or disruption that leads us into disjunction. And when we don't know what to do next, it makes us feel quite unsettled, right? We don't like to sit in that. And that's why we love the pivot metaphor so much. When people say, oh, you just have to pivot. And pivoting, it's quick, right? It's this idea of we need to do a quick pivot. And part of that is because we really have not spent a lot of time growing our capacity and our ability to be in the unknown for longer periods of time, to actually use the unknown as kind of a rich, creative learning space. And so we'll talk more about that. But at points of disjunction, it really is a threshold that different people in different circumstances respond to differently. Sometimes we have that interruption or disruption, as I said, and we know what to do. So it really doesn't spark fear or feeling unsettled. But if we don't know what to do and we wind up unsettled, we can tend to be very, very reactive. We saw a ton of that actually post-COVID, right? Once COVID hit, we had a lot of people who were running around not knowing what they needed to do next. And there was a lot of reaction as opposed to the ability to pause and make sense of new territory, right? Because really what happens on the other side of disjunction is that we wind up in new territory. And the question then becomes, when we're learning to navigate and growing our capacity, how do we deal with new territory? And that's where my work kind of moved into this idea of how do you make sense of finding yourself outside of the familiar, outside of what makes us feel grounded, and opening up into a wilderness that either can feel like a frightening wilderness, the dark woods that we're entering into, or can feel like a generative space for exploration. And a lot of how we deal with that is how we frame it, right? This idea of, do I frame this unknown as something to spark curiosity, or do I frame this unknown as something that is perilous and as a threat to me? Because if in our minds, consciously or unconsciously, we frame it as threat, we will react to it as a threat. And if consciously or unconsciously, we frame it as something that can spark curiosity and inquiry and exploration, we are less likely to view it as a threat and more likely to view it as having potential and having opportunity. But that often happens all very subconsciously. And in my work, I invite people to think about making that subconscious conscious, to make actual definitive choices at those points of inflection. And we'll talk more about that. But before we go deeply into that, I'd actually like to invite you, wherever you're sitting, If you're at your desk, if you're not, if there is I should have said this at the beginning and allowed you a moment to take a look for a piece of paper, something to write with. I know people mostly have electronics these days, so they don't wind up with something to write with. But if you have something handy, even the back of an envelope or something, it doesn't really matter. But I would actually like to open up a space for just about 2 or 3 minutes and ask you to just map your own path, your own career path, and do it real quickly. And think about, you can go back as far as you want. I had my first jobs when I was 11 or 12 years old. Nothing that has to do with my career today. But just take a piece of paper, a simple piece of paper, and just put a dot on the piece of paper for each of these jobs that you've had, or each of these education experiences that you've had. Just one dot, right? Just go from one side of the piece of paper to the other. And I'll be quiet for 2 or 3 minutes and just give you a little time to map your own career path. All right, that's been just a couple of minutes, and feel free to continue doing that while I chat, or if you're listening to this on a recording, feel free to pause and just give yourself a moment. And before we even go forward, I'd just like to acknowledge that most people who I invite to do this will tell me that it's rare that they do this, right? We tend to think about our career paths from where we are forward. And it's infrequent that we actually look back and think about all of the different touch points, all of the different points of inflection that we've had that have gotten us to where we are. And there's an important reminder in any learning, really, of looking backward to look forward. But also, I'd like to ask the second question, which is, now look down at those dots, and you can connect them if you want and make them into kind of a journey or a road or a path or whatever kind of a metaphor, works for you. But when you look at each of those dots and what they represent, jobs you liked, jobs you didn't like, jobs you chose to leave, jobs you were forced to leave, what do you see in your own experience of how you found your way? Where was their intention? Where did you just take the first thing that came, right? And we are in a compressed timetable right now. We're only having an hour together, and I'd like to just present this information to you. But when I work directly with people, I invite them to really think about these things over time, to spend a week or 2 weeks, or sometimes even a month for some people, to really contemplate their own experience at these kind of points of inflection. Because the way that we operate when our lives are disrupted tends to be repeated in some ways. And when it's not repeated, then there's something to learn there, right? And I go back to where I started, this learn to, right? This, how do I learn about myself and how I find my way? Because it's probably very, very different than the way that you do. And if I'm going to grow capacity, I need to go grow capacity from where I am. It's kind of like personal training and physical fitness, right? We're all starting from the level of physical fitness that we have. We're all starting from the upper body strength we do or don't have, or the strength of our legs that we do or don't have. And if we don't do that rigorous self-awareness, if we don't understand our own ways of being in the world, it's very, very hard to then understand how to improve them. And so this is an opportunity for kind of taking a peek at that. And so this idea of how do people find their way, when I started to really work with people deeply and over time in this, many people said to me, I don't know. It was just like I wound up in a circumstance where I needed to make a change, or I wanted to make a change. And then, you know, I did some things. I put out a resume. I asked some people. I met a colleague, and I don't know, I just did that next thing. Other people are much more, you know, particular about it, and they have all kinds of tools and approaches that they use. But in times like COVID, in times like layoffs and so on and so forth, all of those well-laid plans don't always work as well as they do when we're in an interruption or a disruption. So this idea of understanding interruptions and disruptions became a real focus of both my research and my practice. And so that led to this book. I'm not here to sell you books, and I just want to point to this as being something that came out because the culmination of this inquiry with all of these people was the writing of this book. And the title of the book, Stop, Ask, Explore, really comes from, in the United States, and this, I've asked people all over the world, actually, if this is done, and in some cultures it is, in some cultures it's not. But in the United States and some other places, when we're children and we learn emergency preparedness, like fire drills and things like that, we're taught to stop, drop, and roll if we ever were to find ourselves on fire. Right. So it's this, and the genesis of this is really terrible. It's when polyester first came on the market. It was really made with a lot of oil base. So actually there were a lot of people who were going on fire because early polyester used to be highly flammable. But this notion that you learned that if you were ever to go on fire, you should stop, drop, and roll. And what my research showed me is that when we have interruptions or disruptions, particularly ones that we view as a threat, our emotions go on fire. There's a real similarity to the way that we respond. And we then kind of run. And that's what people were doing when they physically went on fire. They would run instead of actually trying to tamp down that fire. And so Stop, Ask, Explore is my answer to that for our own emotional or incendiary emotions that come up when we are in a situation where we had a layoff or something happened that really kind of blew up on us. And career inflection points is a big part of that. So this is an article that I wrote for the Harvard Business Review that relates to this work, and I'll talk about the content of that in a little bit. But this idea of when we're standing at that career inflection point, whether it's at the graduation level, whether it's because we are looking for a promotion, whether it's because we lost our job, this standing at the turning point is something that often feels quite exciting on one hand, but also threatening on the other. And we can get less creative at points of inflection, especially if we're entering into them fearfully. And so before I dive into, kind of giving you a peek at what happens at these points of inflection, I'd just like to open up and see if anybody has any questions, any thoughts about where we are right now, any questions or thoughts about how it felt to write down your career journeys. Just like, let's take a pause together and see if there's any, and I just want to make space for any kind of input or thoughts. And I know people get shy in these situations, so I think there's some things in the chat. Let me just.
So I just want to make sure, can everyone see Joan's PowerPoint? Because we had a participant say no, but most people are saying yes. Just to get a show on the chat, can everyone see the PowerPoint?
I have some people who can.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. I wonder if some people, okay, Courtney said she can now. Okay, just making sure that, okay. Looks like we're getting more people can. For those who are saying no, maybe, I wonder if you're joining on your phone. Sometimes I know on the phone, it can be a little bit different.
Well, what I'll make sure, and I'm sure that you will as well, is I can share this PowerPoint. This really is the only part of the PowerPoint that actually has, content. The others were, for those of you who weren't able to see it, they were really just single word and phrases on the PowerPoint slides. The slide I have up right now is a model that I'm going to talk through, and if I can send it to you in a PDF for you to see it after the fact.
Okay. Okay.
All right, so I'll just close the chat then. If we don't have any questions, then I'll just keep moving through, but please interrupt me because this is a lot, right? It's a different kind of way of thinking about this. So what I'd like to do is point you to the bottom of the model. You can see my cursor here if you can see the screen share, right? And this notion of interruption and disruption. So if you notice the image itself is kind of spiky and pointy on one side and smooth and curvy on the other. And that's by design, because I really like to make sure that people recognize that when we're talking about interruptions and disruptions, they're not only when bad things happen. I think sometimes we view disruptions and interruptions as negative, but it is just as much an interruption or disruption when we get engaged to be married as it is when we lose a job. Because the kind of interruptions and disruptions we're talking about here is anything that takes the path that we're on or the course that we're on and calls us to change course at all, right? So if you're trying to have a child and suddenly find out that now you are going to have a family, that's wonderful news. It's also a complete and utter interruption and disruption to a household, often to a career, often to all aspects of day-to-day life, to routines. The same thing happens when you get a big promotion, right? A big promotion is very exciting, but it also is an interruption and disruption to how you go to work, what you do, new team, how do you start with a new team? And so sometimes, as you can see here, sometimes it's quite clear what you should do next. And so those kinds of interruptions and disruptions, they may turn our path, but they don't wind up being turning points, right? So the road may curve, the path may curve, but it's not standing at a turning point. On the other hand, when we have this kind of an interruption or disruption and we're uncertain about what to do next, when the way forward is not clear, in my work, I call that a what now moment. And so it's now we're standing at that turning point and it's what now? I don't know what to do. And we humans, when we don't know what to do, that really is threatening. And that goes right down into kind of the deepest levels of our psychology. Even highly trained people, even people who, and I did a lot of research into kind of what people do when they're lost in the woods, what people do when they're lost in the desert, what happens with people who do emergency work and are search and rescue professionals. Everybody panics when they immediately find themselves in that what now moment. Even highly trained, highly professional, highly educated and highly competent people, because that moment of not knowing, sometimes people even characterize it as imposter syndrome, right? This self-doubt that happens when we enter into a circumstance where we are outside of our comfort zone, outside of our zone of familiarity. Right? So these what now moments often, and now we're at the top of the model, lead us into kind of disorientation, distraction. It's very emotional for us. The fear kind of kicks in. And when fear kicks in, that leads to more disorientation and distraction, which can lead to further interruption. So you can see if you get into this kind of a fear loop of, I don't know what to do. Now I am in this kind of loop. I am afraid. I'm viewing it as a threat. And now I'm kind of staying in this loop. And so I saw this time and time again with people at every level. And by the way, many people, the way that they deal with this is to be overly certain as well, right? So we tend to think of fear as cowering, but also there are many, many leaders who they shroud their fears by being sure, right? And we saw that at the beginning of COVID as well. No one actually had any business being sure what to do, right? It wouldn't make sense to be sure of what to do when you're dealing with circumstances that are completely unfamiliar. And yet we had a lot of people who were like, I know exactly what to do. This is exactly what we should do. That also is a threat response, right? And so the less threat response, the more response to this as just being new and uncharted territory is up here. This idea of kind of jumping out of a fear loop and getting curious and saying, oh, we are now in uncharted territory. We are now in a place where we don't have maps and best practices and models and any kind of a map to follow about what we do next. So rather than jumping into or quickly pivoting forward, how do we open up space so that we can begin to understand the new territory and then become more experimental and exploratory versus trying to execute through these what now moments? And this is quite central to how this work has taken me. And so now this model, the notion of what now moments and the intentional development of the ability to shift from fear to curiosity at points of inflection has become a model that is used in large companies, small companies. I do a lot of executive coaching with this, both for individuals and for them to help their teams deal with navigating uncertainty and dealing with disruption and interruption. And this notion of inviting people to self-regulate at these points of inflection, then to gather resources that they need, right? So if I can pause long enough to kind of stop the threat response, and then if I can do an initial assessment of what resources do I have, what resources am I missing, where are the gaps, how might I gather the resources that I need, and then how do I begin to think about reorienting in this new territory and do all of that as and before I respond. My research suggests and my practice suggests that there's a greater likelihood of coming up with creative, exploratory responses to points of inflection rather than reactive, very binary, black and white. Because we tend to be, when we're in threat, we tend to be very black and white. And when we're in kind of curiosity and inquiry, we tend to be much more generative at large locus of possibilities, many different possible routes forward, and then we can get creative and experimental about how we do them. And so broadly, this is what I wanted to bring to you. And so I'd love if we can just get into a conversation with some questions.
That'd be great, because actually Dr. Menke has had his hand up. He would like to ask a quick question.
That's great. And I'd like to stop sharing if you don't mind, just so that I can open up and we can all see each other. And I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll just kind of come together.
Wonderful.
Great. Okay, thank you so much. It's a very interesting expose. I have a couple of questions, but I'll start with one.
Great.
In a situation where those disruptions are not linear or they come one at a time, when they come in multiples, how do you deal with them? I'll give you a quick example. Where I'm in Lagos right now, or Nigeria, we have a situation where in the last 2 months, maybe 3 now, there has been disruption with the fuel supply. So people are not getting enough petroleum products for their cars and things like that. And that has been on since last year, which means we don't know when this is going to happen, it's going to stop. On top of that, we had a currency change. So, and which meant that the central bank wanted more people to go digital. So they printed less of the new currency and they were withdrawing, they were mopping up the old currency. And so what do? Not just for yourself, but for the people that work with you who also do not have access to this new currency. On top of that, in a few weeks, we're going to have elections. And then, so is election going to happen? Is there going to be disruption? What's going to happen? How does this address multiple scenarios where, as you are dealing with one, is having maybe adverse, whatever effect on all the other ones? How do you map them at the same time? Thank you.
I love that this is the question that you brought up. Thank you for it, because this is exactly what I found led to the stuckness, right? Most of our models for dealing with change and uncertainty deal with these multiple different variables one at a time. But in actual practice, right? And you think about our science and the way that we research things in small components, right? We pull out a singular component and then we look very deeply into that singular component. We develop models and theories out of that. And then they fall apart in practice, because in practice, we're never just dealing with the oil or the money or the elections. We're dealing with them all in an integrated system. And so all of those different what now moments, I'll use this language, but obviously use your own language. I'm not advocating for the language. It's just to point to this notion that you are 100% correct. This is uncharted territory for you and your community. And if you're operating as a leader in an organization, it's uncharted territory for your organization. So the point is, can you now pause, intentionally pause, not to wait for it to get cleared up, because it probably won't get cleared up. It might not get cleared up for many years, right? And this is what we're finding about 21st century problems. They're very, very integrated and they don't go away, right? So this notion of opening up inquiry and saying, okay, what do I know about this component? And what do I know about this component? And begin to map that in all of its complexity. And that's part of the reason that my work has gravitated towards service design, because that service design actually has methods and tools to help map complex systems. Because what we need to understand is, how does the one also impact the other? It is nonlinear. You're 100% right. The challenge is nonlinear. But again, if you found yourself, if God forbid you found yourself lost in the wilderness, well, that also is not a single variable challenge. You have to get food and water. You're having directional issues. How do I make shelter, right? There's all of these different things that would happen. And if you just immediately said, I know what to do, and started, this is the path we need to take, there's shortcomings to that. But instead, naturally, and we as humans, we have these capacities. We just haven't embraced them to apply them in these environments. What would you do? You'd look around. You'd see, okay, what do I have? What don't I? Is there food still? Is there something? Okay, I do or don't have food. Okay, where could shelter be? Let me climb this tree so I can see over and see if there's right? You would do a number of kind of short-term exploratory things just to get the lay of the land, right? Just to get a better sense of the environment. But too often when we face the very real, right? I'm not trying to undermine that what you just described is paralyzing. And that's where that stuckness that I started researching came from, right? This idea of when you have 5 variables shooting, in succession, we get stuck not because we're incompetent. We get stuck because the complexity that we're entering into doesn't lead to kind of a clear sense of what to do next. And that what now moment now requires different tools, right? So it's not find the model, not find the best practice. It's what are the tools we need to make sense of the new sense-making tools, right? Sense-making, and then discernment among different possibilities, and then experimentation, short time-boxed experiments. Maybe this will work, maybe it won't, right? So that we're having what I call in my work active waiting. Like how do we're active, but we're waiting on a firm decision because we actually don't have the information or even the sense of the situation to be able to trust a firm decision because we're not on firm ground.
Thank you. I just have one follow-up question and then I'm going to shut up.
No, please, we have time. I left a lot of time for questions. I'm hoping we can be in conversation.
Okay, so this is, I like the fact that you said disruption doesn't have to be negative. This is the first way the mind works. It could actually be positive. And and I remember quickly an example of a friend who had been looking for a child in the last 12 years, for instance. And she's got a great job. You know, she's probably top 0.2%. And it's an international job. She's in Nigeria. She's earning Forex. And so it's really good. And then all of a sudden, she had twins. And this job that she does, she covers, you know, she goes everywhere, Zambia, Rwanda, America, Canada, all over the place. And then they gave her actually 6 months for maternity leave. And I thought that was great. Then she was supposed to resume in February 1st. And then I went to see her in January. She had come back to Nigeria. And I could see that she was not physically ready to continue with the job. And then she called me the night on the 31st and says, I'm quitting the job. And I'm like, oh my God. And she asked me one pertinent question. Are you worried about this decision? And then all of a sudden I reflected, and it looks as if when you are at this kind of deflection points, it has to do with your values and your aspirations, what you truly want for yourself. Because and then she said, I need to take care of these twins, at least for the next 1 year. After that, I can decide when. I've waited for them for so long, I cannot begin to abandon them week one. Now that strikes me big time, because when we make these kind of decisions, it's because we are struggling between, should I do what my head is telling me, or should I do what my heart is telling me? I'd like your take on this. Thanks.
I cannot begin to tell you how many people, mostly women, that I work with on this very scenario. Very often women will make a decision to, where do I want to have bringing, children into my path? And some people decide to do it early so that they can then do their career, or vice versa. But it tends to be, like you said, very binary, right? So now here it comes, and I either have to quit or I have to neglect my children, right? That becomes this very binary turning point. And we don't really offer, again, this capacity to say, okay, those are two of the possible choices. What other choices might exist? And because we get stuck on the notion that I am either going to do one or the other. And often that winds up being this kind of true, like a real abandonment of one or abandonment of the other. But when we open up transitional learning space, when we say, okay, I don't know what to do, and I really love my work, and I've worked really hard to bring myself to this part of my career, and I value that, and I also really value these twins, and so on and so forth, right? At the right answer may have been for her to leave. Right. And so when I wind up, if she had come into my world in that point, I would have said to her, I have no idea whether you should leave your job or not. I don't know. But can we create some space for you to consider alternative potential paths here that would allow you to not neglect your children or not, be away from them and keep your hand in your work? Do those possibilities even exist? Is there a third territory between quitting and going back after 6 months to business as usual that exists? And what I find is frequently there are many different choices that exist somewhere outside of those binaries if we open up space and allow ourselves to stay in the ambiguity of uncertainty a little longer, just long enough to be able to engage in some creative problem solving. And often people like that might wind up taking a different role in the same company that has less hours and keeping their hand in things, or entering into the role because of someone at her level with that kind of experience of a consulting advisor for a period of time where she's only brought in for the top most, right? There are many, many different kinds of solutions that people are often quite surprised that they find themselves able to have both. But because they've, to your point, identified what matters to them, and then also gotten really creative about sorting out and making sense of and discerning possibilities. Is there anybody else who has any thoughts or questions or challenges, by the way? I love when people are like, this doesn't jibe for me. This doesn't make sense to me, because we can talk about that as well.
Oh, hi. I just wanted to contribute. My name is Duronke. I'm from, talking from Toronto. I was just going through the example that the gentleman made. And honestly, as women, in the industry, if we don't open up, we'll be surprised at so many creativities, that we can make, just like you were saying. If the company values her, experience, expertise, and the amount of time that she had spent in the company, even if she's not able to travel anymore like before, just because she has little ones, she can still be there as a supporting role, giving them advice, giving them knowledge, tips, and all that. And sometimes as women, we're so scared and we just confine ourselves to just those two options. Is either I keep my job or I go back and still working long hours. So having a talk like this, I think, is really great. And hopefully we can all take that back to ensure that we open up ourselves, we open up the space, think of other alternatives. There has to be something out there. So that's really great. That's I just wanted to contribute.
And Duronke, I think that this is so important, because then we, go and we read all of these articles about the loss of all of this talent, right? And that we have even during COVID, right? So many more women left their jobs than others because suddenly you had this disruption, and now children needed to be educated at home, let's say, or childcare circumstances couldn't happen the same way because of lockdowns, et cetera. And because we are not developing the capacity before the interruption or disruption to have this language and have this, oh, this is a what now moment for us. How are we going to sit and really get creative?
Yeah, absolutely.
We just make quick decisions, and they don't work either for the company that's losing all of that resource and wisdom that they invested in, or for the families, right? So it's a lose-lose instead of trying to open up space to find more generative solutions.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Yes.
I see another hand.
I see Lana has her hand raised.
Yes, hi everyone. Joan, I want to thank you for this amazing discussion, and I look forward to read your book. It's very interesting. It's not a question. I would like to share my thoughts as well on embracing the change, and you have mentioned this in your session. Human beings, they need to embrace the change. Whenever it's something positive or negative, I think we need to leave this panic mode, as you said, stop. And it is about figuring out and be solution oriented. And I believe that characters are different, right? And there are a lot of different personalities in life, and everyone has their circumstances. So we can't say like you have to be courageous or some, but yes, people, they have to be courage enough to move on, not to regret what they have done. Sometimes, like when you reach this standing at the turning point, like you feel like you regret few things that you have done, but this is not the right thing, the right thought or thinking process. It has to be thinking in a positive way, having this positive outlook, take the courage to move on. So regarding the lady who got pregnant, I believe it's about setting priorities. And we as human beings, we set our priorities on daily basis. What do I want to do today? What at 8 a.m., at 9 a.m. So we are setting, by nature, we are setting our priorities. For this lady, I believe she had her priorities. She said, I want to be pregnant, I want to have children. And I believe embracing this as a mother, as long as she is growing from within, she is growing as a mother, she is learning and she is in her journey. And later, nothing can happen, you can't have it everything at the same time. So it's about setting priorities and everything will come through. This is just, I wanted to share this thought. Thank you so much.
I would love to build on what you just shared. First of all, thank you very much for bringing that in. And I think this is a really important point that I want to make sure we're underscoring. I think that there is a lot of energy out in the marketplace right now of ideas of talking about, oh, we have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. We have to be courageous. We have to do these things. And it's very much, here's the list of to-dos, right? You have to have a growth mindset. You have to be empathetic. You have to, right? And so ultimately, that's a lot of self-development and self-change. And quite frankly, that takes decades. One cannot just wake up and decide to now be courageous and growth mindset and so on and so forth. Or even comfortable being uncomfortable. I really loathe that term because you may actually never get comfortable being uncomfortable. You actually may never be courageous. And I'm of the mindset that we still have to get on life with those realities being true, right? This notion that we have to become a different person in order to navigate uncertainty.
Oh, I think, Joan, you were muted for a second, but you're back now.
Somebody just muted me. No, that's fine. Right, so this notion that we have to become a different person in order to navigate, I think puts a double burden on people. So what I would like to invite you to is the notion that at this point of inflection, you are what you are. And if it's scared, then acknowledging, oh, I'm scared. So how do I resource myself for my fear? Or I'm uncomfortable. Let me acknowledge that is what is true. I don't have to pretend to be a different person. I don't have to pretend to be a different way. Can I say right now, or I'm confused, or I'm overwhelmed, or all of those things? I don't have to get over it as much as I have to acknowledge it and then gather the resources that I need to be able to then function in that way. And then maybe after the dust settles and after the storm clears, maybe I say, I need more resources for next time because I do get afraid when this happens, or I do get overwhelmed when that happens. And this way, what we can do is we can actually recognize that we can function even in our weakness. We don't all have to become strong to function, because many times we are forced and faced with circumstances where we are under-equipped, right? So this is how do I, and again, going back to that example of being kind of in the wilderness, you may find yourself in the wilderness with a broken ankle or in the wilderness with a twisted ankle. And so then one of the first things you need to do is find something to splint that ankle or get a crutch or do something else. There's no, shame in needing a crutch when your ankle is broken. But the social and other resources we can gather are the equivalents of that so that we can be as strong as we can, not as individuals, but gather the community around us to have the strength that we need to do the things that are the next right things. And I see one hand, and I think that may be time for one of the last questions, just watching time to be careful.
Okay.
I'd love to hear from you, Charles.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Charles. Very nice lecture from you. Can we also say that it's not what happens to you that matters in the course of a journey, but how you react to it? In the course of a long journey, what happens to you could be positive or negative. It may not matter about how you react. Can you conclude with that?
Well, every reaction and every response is an opportunity for learning. And that's why I like the learn to navigate instead of the how to navigate, right? So it's more like, and that's why experimental, right? If you go into a lab and a scientist is doing experiments, they don't view the experiment that went wrong as a negative. They view the experiment that went wrong as a source of new information and generating new questions. And so we may react. We may react on our threat. We may do all of the quote wrong things, but they're not really wrong or right. They're helpful or unhelpful in the circumstance we're in. And we want to maximize helpful things and minimize unhelpful things and learn from them over and over again. So if we can have that learning orientation, if we can be curious about our own selves and how we fit in the world, then that curiosity will propel us forward, and we'll constantly be learning and changing, not to become a different person, but to become more adaptive and adept at dealing with changing circumstances. At least that's the premise that I come to this with.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for all these wonderful questions, and a huge thank you to Joan for coming and speaking with us today. It was great to be able to share all this, and a lot of people have written some wonderful comments about how this discussion hit the right situation. So we appreciate everybody being here. Of course, if you have any questions, please feel free. You can always reach out to us at ISM, and we look forward to hopefully seeing many of you at the next guest speaker series. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your days.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you so much.